Hello again. Um, this will be Gutters Part 2, or Chapter 2, technically. Same thing. Okay, I'm gonna read now. By the time the December ship comes, there is no one left in the shelter that had come in with him. Peter is cleaning cots when the ship begins to unload, and within minutes he begins to catch bits and pieces of hushed news and whispered rumors, as he always does. People are quick to assess the groups coming in, and are faster still at jumping to conclusions based on where they had been found. If there were a large group of survivors from the one area, it meant that there was hope of rebuilding in that country. If there were no survivors from another area, it meant that hope was lost for them, and good riddance, nothing to be done about it. Generally, he ignores the gossip, as much of it is rarely true. There's not anything new to be learned. Most of the world is dead, including his beloved family, and beyond that, he doesn't care to know. He doesn't want to return to the surface and see what had become of the land, and he certainly doesn't want to see the pit full of fire-blackened skeletons just outside the bunker doors, and so he ignores them as the haggard team of rescue workers begins to carry new survivors inside and continues to clean the beds alongside the other boys. "Haven't you heard?" one says. "What?" asks another. "But who they found in the last run." "Ah, I did." But a third chimes in. "About the blonde guy, eh?" One of the boys shakes Peter's shoulder. "Did you hear?" Peter eyes him warily and goes back to his work. "No." "Everybody they found was in the Netherlands and France, except for one." "Yeah." The second boy nods enthusiastically. "They found him above the German border." "So?" Peter has only been half listening to them in the first place, staring placidly at the dirty canvas in front of him. He doesn't care. Gossip is gossip, and it's never done any of them a lick of good, and he's had quite enough of getting his hopes up. "So they found him on the last patch of dry land in Denmark. You know, the one that sunk? They said he was speaking Swedish." The bucket clatters and spills rank water all over the floor when his foot catches the handle as he bolts for the bunker doors. It takes him 15 minutes of pushing through throngs of people before he finally makes it to the front of the line, where workers are unloading the caravan full of people. Some are able to walk on their own, but most are being brought in on makeshift stretches or are being carried, and Peter watches, anxious, as they bring each group in, frantically searching for the rumored Swede. As the groups began to thin out, he yanks the sleeve of another spectator. "I heard they found a guy in Denmark. Didn't they bring him in?" he asks. "Yeah," the man replies and jerks his thumb in the direction of the wall. "Brought him in first. They wanted to keep him close to the doors." Peter frowns. "Why?" The man just laughs. "Less distance to carry him in the morning. People are already staking claims on his clothes." Peter's eyes widen at this, and he pushes away from the man and begins to search the walls, looking for any sign of who he is looking for. There are plenty of new faces, all of them wrapped in threadbare wool blankets, some crying and others staring blankly ahead, all coughing and reeking of infection, clutching their belongings to their chest and trying to ignore the greedy looks of the others. At the far end of the bunker, tucked in the corner, Peter finally finds the man in question, laid out on the floor beneath a blanket, surrounded by a tight ring of whispering people waiting like vultures, but not bothering to get close enough to check for life. Peter shoves past them all, shouting at them to move, and drops to his knees beside the covered figure on the ground, hands hovering above the dirty blanket. Through the fabric, he can hear the man taking wet, rattling breaths, shallow and too fast to be healthy, his shoulders just barely moving beneath the blanket. "Don't touch him," someone shouts. "He's sick." Peter ignores them and tugs the blanket back. A sob tears through him as soon as the covers settle. "It's just a stranger." No one that he knows. His hair is blonde and long and singed with ash, his jaw set in a hard grimace and blood slowly dribbling out of his ears and onto his quivering shoulders each time he takes a struggled breath. Even with his burnt flesh, though, Peter can immediately tell the man is not even Swedish. No glasses, no calloused hands, not who he wants to see. Peter pulls the blanket back up over him and staggers to his feet, wrist whipping across his eyes as he shoves past the crowd to get back to his bed. He falls into his cot and buries his face in his damp, stinking pillow and curls his fingers into the heels of his hands in the shaky hope that his nails biting into his palms will keep him from making too much noise as the tears continue to rush down his cheeks and into the dirty canvas of his bed. Rumors are only rumors. He should have known better. He tucks into himself and clutches the front of his shirt. He never found England, and this is no different. He never should have gotten his hopes up. Sweden is dead. Finland is dead. The land is dead. The people are dead. The animals are dead. Everything is dead. Papa. He chokes quietly into his pillow. The response he wants never comes, and the sick man is dead before the day ends. 6 months later, and the boats stop coming. At first, the rush of survivors only slows to a trickle. The barge is bringing back a dozen people compared to the 50 or so average that they have been maintaining, and the people who manage to make the trip to Munich often don't live long enough to even get a bed. Soon, though, 12 turns into 10, and 10 turns into 5, and by the time June arrives, no one has heard from the envoy captains in over a month, and the bunker doors are only ever open to carry out the dead. When July comes, the rations begin to thin out, and with no boats coming, there is no depending on scavenged goods to keep the supply bins stocked. Peter does a well enough job when it comes to hoarding and keeping his share of items safe, but thievery quickly overtakes the barter system, and soon his protein bars and canned vegetables begin to disappear, and he starts to store everything he has in a ratty backpack, which he carries with him at all times, awake or in sleep. Even cutting down on his stolen goods, Sealand's health is nothing to boast about. His nose is perpetually runny, and when the bunker's air filters cease to function, he frequently loses his voice under the strain of breathing the hot, dust-filled air. He's shivery and weak, and he's lost more weight than he would care to admit. Enough so that he can no longer keep himself warm at night, even wrapped in his threadbare bundle of wool blankets. He will lie on his side and curl himself into a ball, tight as he can, and rub his hands up and down his lean arms, trying to coax out the heat with the slow friction, teeth chattering until the morning bell rings, and he drags himself out of bed to resume his work in cleaning clots. He's the only one left with the job. The 3 boys who once accompanied him are long dead. One of starvation, one of sickness, one of head trauma after being caught stealing a box of Band-Aids. It's a mess, and every day that Peter wakes up still breathing, he wonders if he really has anything to be thankful for. Sometimes, when it storms hard enough, Sealand can hear the rain tattering against the door of the shelter. It's a comforting sound, monotonous and consistent, and it reminds him of home, bringing the unreal scent of fresh, clean nature with it every time the clouds gather over Munich. He's well aware that the rain that comes now is nothing like the rain that fell then, and that if he were to go outside, it would make his lungs hurt worse than they already do. But with every storm, he contents himself by dragging his cot to the entrance of the bunker, where he can lay beneath the covers and listen to the drops patter against the door. Those are the only nights that he can sleep and feel well rested in the morning. He makes the mistake of making it a habit, however, and others soon begin to catch on to the fact that when it rains, he is lulled far enough from their fetid little world for the scavengers to come out unchallenged. His stash of rations dwindles each time he falls asleep by the door, but as far as he is concerned, it is a small price to pay for the hours of dead sleep that he gets. There is one stormy night where his rest is interrupted. He is laying on his stomach when the blankets drawn up over his head with the blankets drawn up over his head when the steady drip of rain is suddenly broken by the muffled sound of the metal clasp on his backpack being undone. It hardly makes a sound, barely a click. But for the split second it exits, it ruins the rain, and Peter flies up in bed and meets the startled eyes of a man on the floor. The man is new by their standards, having come in with the very last envoy, and still looks to be in decent enough health. His hair has not yet lost its luster, and his skin is still pink and untainted by spending months underground. He stares up at Peter from his place on his knees, the backpack held in both hands, and for a moment they just look at each other before the man scrambles to his feet and tries to run. Peter doesn't know why they always run. It's not like there's anywhere to go. Nonetheless, the pack contains the last of his rations, and Sealand flies to his feet and bolts after the man, throwing himself at his waist and dragging him to the floor by a line of cots along the wall. The backpack tumbles from his hand, and Peter crawls over him to make a grab for the shoulder strap, panting with the exertion of running for less than half of a minute, and pulls the bag up as he starts back for his bed. The man's hand closes around on Peter's ankle, and he flips onto his stomach while he forces the boy's feet out from under him, sending him crashing to the damp concrete floor, the backpack again rolling out of their reach. Sealand yelps loudly and kicks at the stranger. "Let go of me," he shouts. "That bag is mine." The man snarls and shoves Peter sideways. He starts to pick himself up and shifts forward to grab the bag, but Sealand fists the back of the man's shirt and hauls him back down. Stop it, you brat," he hisses and kicks back at him. His heel catches Peter's chin and sends him sprawling onto his back. He stoops down and reaches for the bag, and again Peter launches himself at the man. "Give it back, it doesn't belong to you." He manages to get a grip on the bag and pulls it against his chest just as the man knocks him over, setting him skidding across the floor. He pushes himself up onto his quaky skinned knees and hugs the bag tightly, glaring hard at him. The man meets his gaze with just as angry of a look and starts to stalk forward again, his hands balled into fists and his lips curled back in a furious sneer. "Give it to me, you little shit." He grabs the front of Sealand's shirt and yanks him up, drawing his fist back. "Give it to someone who actually has a chance." Peter starts to reply, but his struggles are cut short by a loud, metallic bang. Both of them freeze, and the whole bunker is quiet in an instant, every person with working eyes turning to stare at the shelter doors. There is a beat of silence before another thud resounds through the room, and people begin scrambling to hide. They tip over cots and empty supply bins and scratch at each other for space behind anything solid, dread beginning to seep through the small crowd as they fight for a place to shield themselves. No one has come to the bunker doors in months, but rumors of violent raiders have nestled into the minds of the shelter residents, and stacked with the rampant sickness and everyday violence, paranoia has taken a hold of every person there. They know that they are dying, but are still too scared to face it at the hands of anyone but themselves. The man swallows and drops Peter as he hurries to find his own place to hide. Peter gets slowly to his feet and stumbles back to his cot, backpack secured over his shoulders as he drags his bed away from the door and folds it down in the far corner of the room and shimmies beneath it. He knows he should be scared. The heavy locks on the doors are broken and anyone can open it from the outside, survivors and raiders alike. But through his exhaustion, he can manage only a bare nervousness when the banging stops and is replaced by a rusty groan of the door handle spinning. Silence sweeps over the bunker, and no one utters a sound when the doors creak open, rain and wind immediately overtaking the hushed, hidden crowd. Peter folds his arms and hides his face between them, making himself as small as possible and listening tense as heavy footsteps begin to echo through the shelter. The steps are slow and cautious, and each footfall jangles with the sound of bits of metal clinking together and wet fabric that shifts against itself and quiet flaps against what sounds like plastic. Peter curiously lifts his head enough to stare around at his bed, catching sight of the visitor as they move into the center of the bunker, illuminated by the last dim bulb that they have. He is tall and soaked with rain, his face hidden by what looks like the tattered remains of an old bedsheet, eyes shielded by dark wielding goggles, their lenses streaked with rain and mud. He keeps the collar of his heavy trench coat turned up around his neck and buttoned up as high as it will go. The ragged hem slick and sticking to his tall boots. He walks slowly, and with a slight limp, he keeps his gloved hands wrapped around the stock of a long, old-looking rifle as he cautiously steps further into the wide room. Peter swallows thickly and hides his face again. It has been over a year since he has seen anyone with a gun, and he doesn't particularly want to look down its barrel if it is going to blow his face off. The footsteps stop in the center of the room, and for a moment there's not a single sound. The rifle clacks as the stranger shoulders it, and there's a slight rustling in fabric. "Hello?" a hoarse voice calls. Anybody alive in here?" Peter's head snaps up. He knows that voice. He forces himself to his feet and pushes past his cot to rush to the middle of the bunker, standing several feet away from the stranger. The man looks down at him, startled, and starts to recoil, his gun slipping from his shoulder and hitting the floor. He has his sodden head wrapped partially unwound, and Peter can just barely see his mouth, lips chapped and pale beneath the colorful sheet, and he watches as they open and close uselessly several times. "Peter?" There is another stretch of silence, this time broken by hushed, vapid whispering as the other residents watch the stranger yank his goggles off and wrap off, revealing a shock of overgrown blonde hair and wide blue eyes. He drops the sheet, and Peter's face crumples. His hair is longer than Sealand remembered, and one of his eyes is half shut and milky white. But even with his thin body and sharper features, the connection is instantly made. He has the same face and the same stupid expression, and when he drops to his knees and opens his arms, Peter's eyes spill over with tears, and a strange sob tears through him as he pitches forward. "Matthias!" he cries, voice cracking, and throwing his arms around Denmark's neck, clinging to him when his knees give out and he collapses against him in a trembling mess, his shirt soaking through with second-hand rain. Relief floods him and ignites his belly with a warmth when Denmark doesn't disappear beneath his hands like his friends so often do in his dreams, and he hiccups, pressing his face into the crook of the other man's wet neck. You're okay." Denmark's arms circle around him and pull him close into a hug that, any other time, Sealand would have complained about being too tight. A hand coming up to the back of the boy's head and into his hair. "Peter," he breathes quietly. "Peter, you're..." He draws back enough to cradle Sealand's face in his hands, his good eye looking him up and down, disbelievingly assessing him before he breaks out into a wide smile and hauls him back into his arms, swinging him back and forth, laughing loudly and burying his face against the young man's shoulder. "Holy shit, Peter." As Peter clutches to him and sobs into his jacket, the others start to slowly come out of hiding, and a circle begins to form around them, suspicious eyes darting to the rifle on the floor and the large bags on Denmark's back. Before Peter can even catch his breath, one of the crooked veterans of the shelter steps forward and grabs the back of Denmark's coat, pulling him back enough to get his attention. "Who are you?" His eyes narrowed when Denmark ignores her and shakes her hand off, going back to smothering Sealand against his chest. She frowns and shoves at him. "I asked you a question," she barks. "What are you doing here?" Denmark turns around and glares at her. "Do you mind?" he growls and pulls Sealand closer. "In case you haven't noticed, we're kind of having a moment here." She squints angrily at him and jerks her head in the direction of the bunker doors. "You can't stay here," she spits. "There aren't enough beds and there isn't enough food." She kicks his rifle back to him and it knocks against his wobbly knees. His knobby knees. Get out. No! Peter wriggles out of Denmark's arms and stands protectively in front of him. Please, he can have my cot and some of my rations. And he coughs wetly and scrubs his hands over his eyes. Don't make him leave. He steps back and grabs Denmark's hand, pulling him to his feet and holding tightly onto his arm. Please don't make him leave. She stares at them both and crosses her arms in front of herself. What's he to you? She leers incredulously at the Dane, he paying her no mind and dropping a hand on Seeland's shoulder. Give me a good reason why we shouldn't kick him out back into the rain. Peter swallows thickly and squeezes Denmark's hand. He bites his lip and stands closer to him. He's my uncle. She pauses for a moment and watches them both as Denmark winds his arms around Peter's shoulders, hands clasped over his, standing behind him and evenly meeting her gaze in such a staunch challenge of wills. After a long beat of silence, her lips curl back and she waves a dismissive hand at him. Fine, he can stay the night. Her hand closes into a fist and she points at him. But I want you gone in the morning, do you hear me? And if you touch anything that doesn't belong to you, you'll be in the pit with the rest of them. Understand? Denmark frowns at her. Who the hell died and made you boss? Mitchell Donovan, she replies tersely. You don't move from the cot, you don't talk to anyone, and you don't touch anything. Are we clear? Denmark's arms tighten around Seeland. Crystal. Good. She turns around and starts to stalk back to her own corner of the room, but thinks better of it and turns back to try and snatch the rifle off the floor. Denmark is faster than she is, however, and easily pulls it out of her reach. I don't think so, he snarls, grinning when she glares furiously at him. It took me too long to find that, to let you have it. This is mine, and so is this. He pats the bag on his back, and if I catch any of you touching it, he nods at Peter, or touching him or any of his things, I'll bash your face in before you know what's happening. He smiles warmly at her, cocking his head. Are we clear? She scoffs and turns on her heel. Crystal. Peter pulls Denmark to his cot on the wall, easily ignoring the stares of the others, and pushes him to sit down once he's peeled out of his wet coat and boots, leaving him damp and cold in his pants and torn ratty sweater. He seats himself on the edge of the bed and lets Seeland fuss over him, his smile never faltering as the boy drapes a blanket around his shoulders and hangs his coat to dry over the crossbar beneath the bed. I can't believe you're alive, he murmurs. How did you get out of England? Peter crouches down and hides Denmark's boots under his coat. I don't know. He straightens back up and shrugs his backpack off. I can't really remember anything. One of the boats picked me up and brought me here. He opens his bag and starts to pull a box of calorie bars out, but Denmark's hand drops on his, and he shakes his head. Keep it, he says, and bends down to grab his own pack, unzipping it to pull the flap back and draw out an unlabeled can. He grins and crosses his legs, motioning for Seeland to sit in his lap as he pulls a dented spoon from his pocket. It's my treat. Peter nods and stashes his bag back away, eagerly crawling up to sit on Denmark's legs, his back flush with the larger man's chest, smiling when the Dane's arms pull the blanket around them both, and he starts to wrestle the can open. What is it? He asks. Denmark shrugs. Who knows? He drops his chin to rest on top of Seeland's head. Something awesome, I'm sure. Peter can feel his jaw shift as he smiles again. I don't care what it is, though. I don't think this day can get any better. The top of the can pulls free, and Peter peers inside, his hands immediately shooting out to slap over the opening, a panicked expression overtaking his face at once. Denmark blinks, surprised. What's the matter? Peter shakes his head. We can't let anyone see this. he whispers. There are people here who would kill you for this. Denmark pauses, but after a moment draws the blanket up over their heads and leans back against the wall until they are completely covered. What is it? He asks quietly. Spaghetti. He turns to look back at Denmark, eyes wide. Where did you find this? In a burnt-out gas station outside of Bern. Peter gapes at him. In Switzerland? How did you... Denmark cuts him off and presses the spoon into his hand. The soft leather of his gloves, a stark contrast to the rough skin of Peter's palm. We can talk about that later, he says and curls the boy's fingers around the utensil. Eat. You're even skinnier than you were before all this happened. Peter takes the spoon and dips it into the cold noodles, nodding slowly. So are you. Denmark shrugs, and through the thin fabric of his shirt, Peter can see the Dane's jutting collarbone shift above his collar. I'm still bigger than you, he teases. He brings his arms around Peter's waist and places his chin on the boy's shoulder. Now eat. Seelan twirls the spoon until he has gathered a small clump of noodles. Okay, he says and brings it to his lips. But you have to have some too. We can share it. Only after Denmark agrees does Peter finally begin to eat. After so many months of tasteless rations, the sweet, rubbery noodles are like nothing he's ever tasted. He'd nearly forgotten the tang of tomatoes and the sharpness of salt, and the easy give of the pasta between his teeth is a welcome change from the hard, crumbly bars that he has become so accustomed to. Denmark laughs slowly as he watches Peter excitedly tear his way through the can, and between them both, the spaghetti is gone in less than a minute. Seelan hides the can in his backpack before anyone can see it, but they don't come out from their blanket tent. Even though it was barely half of a can, Peter feels full for the first time in over a year. Denmark resettles himself on his side, and Seeland is quick to follow, curling up against him and holding on to the front of his ratty shirt. He's still a bit wet and smells like sweat and smoke, but not the chemical kind. He can't quite place it, but it reminds Seeland of a campfire. Campfires that he used to have with... Peter swallows thickly. Denmark wraps his arms around him and tilts his head down so that he can look at him. What's wrong? His fingers tighten in the fabric of Denmark's sweater. Have you found anyone else? He asks quietly. There was a long pause wherein Denmark exhales slowly, a rattling, thin sound. A few, he says after a moment. I found Spain in Nepal's. He's missing a leg, but he's doing all right. You were in Italy? He nods. For a little while. Feliciano, or however you pronounce his name, Feliciano is hanging in there, but Romano is dead. He sighs again. They had Monaco with them, and they're trying to dig people out of what's left of the capital. They had heard a rumor that Prussia and Germany were still kicking, so he trails off. Here I am. But you haven't found... No. Denmark cuts him off. No one that we're looking for. His arms tighten around Seelan's waist, and he pulls him closer. Oh. Denmark pulls a hand up to the back of Peter's head and draws him forward to press his face into the boy's hair. Don't think about it right now, he says softly. You've had too much time to think about it already. I'll explain everything in the morning, okay? Seelan nods and rubs at his eyes. Okay. For several moments, they make themselves comfortable and still under the covers, and Peter does his best to ignore the campfire smell and the way Denmark's ribs poke his arms, while the older man protectively wraps himself around him. Faintly, Seelan can hear a low rattling, emanating from the Dane's chest, but as his eyes drift shut, he focuses on the steady thrumming of his heart instead, a solid reminder that he is still there. He doesn't mind that his shirt is still damp or that his embrace is so tight. The warmth that begins to build between them, caught beneath the blankets, is much more comforting, and for the first time since the calamity, Peter feels safe. Not sheltered or hidden, but truly safe. He shifts his hands down to touch Denmark's, tapping his knuckles. Denmark? He whispers. Could you... He trails off. Can you take off your gloves for a second? Denmark hesitates, but nods and awkwardly reaches around Seelan to strip off his gloves and tucks them away in his pocket, fanning his fingers when Peter reaches forward to lace their hands together. He's so much smaller than Denmark's. His hands... Oh my gosh. His so much... His so much smaller than Denmark's when the older man clasps his hand over Peter's. He closes his eyes and breathes deeply, a faint smile working the corners of his mouth up when the Dane's warm, scratchy palms brush across his knuckles, distant familiarity appearing in the back of his mind when the realization hits him. It's such a cine little thing, but it makes Peter want to cry all over again. Denmark's hands are riddled with calluses. That's the end of the second chapter. Okay, have a good night or day, wherever you are.